In the summer of 1944, as the dust of Normandy was still settling and the wreckage of shattered divisions lay scattered across the French countryside, one name echoed with growing urgency through the headquarters of the German High Command: Patton. General George S. Patton was not just another Allied commander. To the German army, he was speed, he was unpredictability, he was relentless pressure. And above all, he was movement, the kind of movement that could turn an orderly retreat into a catastrophic collapse. Patton had taken command of the U.S. Third Army in August 1944, just as the Allied breakout from Normandy transformed into a sweeping offensive across France. Operation Cobra had punched a hole in the German lines, but it was Patton who drove through that hole like a spear. His armored columns did not pause. They did not consolidate. They advanced. Within days, American forces were racing across Brittany, seizing towns, crossroads, and supply hubs faster than German staff officers could update their situation maps. Entire German units found themselves cut off, encircled, or overrun before they even understood where the main thrust was coming from. Patton believed in momentum as a weapon. He often said that a good plan violently executed now was better than a perfect plan next week. That philosophy defined the Third Army's advance. Instead of cautious, methodical progress, Patton demanded speed. Fuel trucks ran day and night. Mechanics repaired vehicles on the roadside. Infantry rode atop tanks to keep pace. His message to subordinates was clear: keep moving. To understand why the Germans feared him so deeply, one must understand the fragile state of the Wehrmacht in late 1944. After the disaster in Normandy, particularly the encirclement at the Falaise Pocket, German forces in the West were bleeding. Thousands had been killed or captured. Equipment was abandoned in chaotic retreats. Veteran units were shadows of their former strength. Yet even in retreat, the German army remained dangerous. It still possessed experienced officers, effective artillery, and most importantly, armored reserves. But reserves only mattered if they could be concentrated in time. Patton's speed made that nearly impossible. In late August, his forces crossed the Seine River and pushed eastward toward the German border. Supply shortages briefly slowed the entire Allied advance. Fuel became the bloodline of war, and trucks could not deliver enough of it. But whenever supplies reached him, Patton surged forward again. German intelligence had long considered Patton the Allies' most aggressive field commander. In fact, during the preparations for D-Day, the Germans were convinced he would lead the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Even after the landings in Normandy, they hesitated to redeploy armored divisions because they feared Patton was still waiting to strike elsewhere. His reputation alone had strategic weight. Now that he was unleashed in France, that reputation was becoming reality. By September 1944, Patton's Third Army had liberated vast stretches of territory. Cities like Nancy and Metz became focal points of intense fighting. Lorraine, a region of rolling hills, rivers, and fortified towns near the German border, would soon become a battleground of immense significance. For the German High Command, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. If Patton broke through Lorraine and reached the Saar industrial region, Germany's war economy would face direct threat. Coal, steel, and armaments, already strained by Allied bombing, could collapse entirely. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, understood the danger. So did Adolf Hitler. They did not merely see an advancing army, they saw a commander who thrived on chaos and exploited hesitation. Patton's leadership style amplified that danger. He was visible. He visited front-line units wearing his polished helmet and ivory-handled pistols. He spoke bluntly, often profanely, but always with conviction. Soldiers believed he wanted to win, and win fast. That belief mattered.
Under his command, combined arms warfare was executed with increasing efficiency. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and close air support were coordinated to punch through defensive lines. When resistance stiffened, Patton shifted axes of advance rather than battering endlessly at one point. His flexibility forced German defenders to spread thin. Meanwhile, the German army faced structural problems that speed exposed mercilessly. Fuel shortages plagued their armored units, rail lines were bombed, replacement crews lacked training, and communication networks were strained by constant retreat. Each kilometer Patton gained widened the gap between German intentions and German capabilities. Yet Lorraine was not an open highway. The region contained old French fortifications, river barriers like the Moselle, and terrain well suited for defense. German commanders believed they could finally slow him there. Reinforcements were rushed in, including heavy armored units equipped with Tiger tanks. But before the clash of steel, there was anticipation, a tightening of the line. By October, the rains began. Mud slowed vehicles, rivers swelled, even Patton's momentum encountered friction. The siege of Metz became a grinding struggle against fortified positions that had withstood previous wars. German defenders dug in, determined to prove that the Third Army could bleed. And it bled. Casualties mounted, progress slowed to meters instead of miles. For the first time since the breakout from Normandy, Patton's advance appeared vulnerable to stalling. German commanders took note. If he could be fixed in place, if his spearhead could be blunted, the front might stabilize. But Patton adapted. He reorganized his attacks, rotated divisions, and maintained pressure. He understood that pauses gave the enemy time to recover. Even when weather grounded aircraft and mud swallowed tanks, he insisted on offensive action. To the German high command, this persistence was alarming. Many Allied generals consolidated gains. Patton sought the next breakthrough. Reports flowing into Berlin painted a worrying picture. American artillery superiority was overwhelming. Allied air power, when weather permitted, devastated supply routes, and Patton's armored units seemed to reappear wherever German lines were weakest. It was in this context that discussions began about deploying significant armored strength to halt him decisively, not merely delay him, stop him. German heavy tank battalions, equipped with Tiger tanks, were among the few formations capable of dominating a battlefield through sheer firepower and armor. A properly positioned Tiger could destroy American Sherman tanks at long range before the Shermans could effectively respond. If concentrated, these heavy tanks might shatter Patton's spearheads. But concentration required time, and time was the one resource Patton seemed determined to deny. By late autumn 1944, the stage was set. On one side stood the U.S. Third Army, aggressive, mobile, increasingly experienced. On the other stood a German force desperate to regain initiative, willing to commit some of its most formidable armored assets to the struggle. The coming confrontation would not simply be about tanks or territory, it would be about tempo. Could German steel halt American speed? Could heavy armor anchor a collapsing front? Or would momentum prove stronger than mass? For now, the answer was uncertain. But in headquarters tents lit with dim lamps and in stone buildings where maps were covered in grease pencil arrows, a decision was forming. If Patton could not be slowed by ordinary means, extraordinary force would be required. The order would soon be given, and when it was, 92 of Germany's most feared tanks would move toward Lorraine, toward the man the Wehrmacht had come to regard not just as an enemy general, but as a strategic threat. The clash was inevitable.
By the autumn of 1944, as the fighting in Lorraine intensified and General George S. Patton continued to press eastward, the German High Command faced a grim reality. Ordinary defensive measures were no longer enough.
Infantry divisions were exhausted. Panzer units were under strength. Fuel was scarce. And yet, one weapon remained capable of reshaping a battlefield through sheer dominance: the Tiger tank. To the Allies, it was a mechanical monster. To German crews, it was both shield and sword. To commanders in Berlin, it was a last steel hammer. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, had already earned a fearsome reputation on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. Weighing over 50 tons, protected by thick frontal armor, and armed with the devastating 88mm KWK-36 gun, it could destroy most Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. In open terrain, a well-positioned Tiger could dominate entire sectors. But by late 1944, an even more formidable variant had appeared: the Tiger II, often called the King Tiger. Heavier still, with sloped frontal armor reaching up to 150 millimeters in thickness, and equipped with the longer, more powerful 88mm KWK-43 gun, it was arguably the most powerful operational tank of the war. On paper, these machines were nearly invincible. American M4 Sherman tanks, the backbone of Patton's armored forces, were reliable and mobile, but their standard 75mm guns struggled against the frontal armor of a Tiger. Even the improved 76mm versions required close range or flanking shots to penetrate effectively. In a head-to-head engagement at long distance, the advantage clearly belonged to the Germans. German commanders understood this disparity. If they could lure Patton's spearheads into prepared defensive zones where Tigers were positioned hull down behind ridges or concealed along tree lines, American armor could be cut apart before it closed the distance. But reality was more complicated than specifications. Heavy tank battalions, known as schwere Panzerabteilungen, were independent units, not permanently attached to divisions. They were meant to be deployed where breakthroughs needed to be sealed or where decisive counterattacks could be launched. By late 1944, however, many of these battalions were shadows of their intended strength. The decision to send 92 Tiger tanks into the Lorraine sector represented a significant concentration of Germany's remaining heavy armor in the West. Crews were ordered forward by rail and road. Maintenance teams worked frantically to prepare vehicles for combat. Spare parts were loaded. Ammunition stocks were assembled. For the German High Command, this was not merely reinforcement. It was a statement. Patton must be stopped. The journey to the front exposed the first cracks in the illusion of invincibility. Allied air superiority, when weather allowed, made daylight movement dangerous. Fighter bombers prowled rail lines and highways. A single rocket strike could immobilize a tank before it ever reached battle. Mechanical reliability posed another challenge. Tiger tanks were engineering marvels, but they were also temperamental. Their massive weight strained engines and transmissions. Tracks wore down quickly. Fuel consumption was enormous. In an army already suffering chronic shortages of gasoline, deploying such heavy machines was a logistical gamble. Some tanks broke down en route. Others arrived with engines overheating or gearboxes requiring immediate repair. Crews trained extensively, but training could not eliminate the physical stress placed on a 70-ton machine maneuvering through mud-choked French roads. Still, when operational and properly positioned, Tigers were lethal. German doctrine envisioned them as mobile strongpoints. Rather than charging recklessly, they were to be used defensively, anchoring lines, counterattacking at decisive moments, and exploiting their superior range. Commanders hoped that in the rolling terrain of Lorraine, with its villages, forests, and ridgelines, Tigers could create killing grounds. The psychological effect alone was significant. American tank crews had learned to respect the Tiger. Reports from earlier battles described shells bouncing harmlessly off frontal armor. Stories circulated of single Tigers destroying multiple Shermans in minutes. Whether exaggerated or not, such accounts influenced morale. But American soldiers were not naive. By late 1944, American forces had adapted. Tank destroyer units armed with high-velocity 76 and 90mm guns were integrated into operations. Artillery coordination had improved dramatically. Perhaps most importantly, Allied air power had become a decisive factor. The German plan relied on concentration, massing heavy tanks at critical points. Yet concentration required movement, and movement exposed them to reconnaissance aircraft and fighter bombers. Even a Tiger's thick armor could not withstand repeated rocket and bomb strikes from above. As the 92 Tigers assembled, their commanders faced strategic tension. Should they be used aggressively to strike Patton's spearheads, or defensively to blunt attacks around key objectives like Metz and the approaches to the Saar? Hitler's influence loomed over such decisions. He often demanded rigid defense, forbidding withdrawals even when tactically sensible. This rigidity sometimes turned powerful units into static targets. Meanwhile, Patton continued to probe German lines. His forces tested defenses, identified weak points, and applied pressure across a broad front. Rather than offering a single obvious axis of advance, he forced the Germans to guess where the main blow would fall. For the heavy tank battalions, this uncertainty was dangerous. Tigers were most effective when positioned deliberately. Rapid redeployment across muddy terrain risked breakdowns, yet staying static invited encirclement or air attack. As October turned to November, weather became a temporary ally for the Germans. Rain and low clouds limited Allied air operations. Ground conditions deteriorated, slowing American armor. This was the window German commanders hoped for, a chance to use their steel hammer without constant threat from the sky. In concealed positions near villages and along wooded ridges, Tiger crews prepared for battle. Camouflage nets were draped over turrets. Engines were kept warm in the cold air. Ammunition was stacked within reach. Periscopes scanned the horizon. Inside each tank, 5 men operated in cramped coordination: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. Communication was critical. The commander identified targets. The gunner adjusted elevation and traverse. The loader slammed heavy 88mm shells into the breach. Seconds determined survival. When the first engagements occurred, the destructive power of the Tigers was undeniable. At long range, American tanks were struck before they could effectively respond. In several clashes, Shermans were knocked out in quick succession. Reports flowed back to American headquarters. Heavy German tanks confirmed. But the battlefield was not static. American artillery responded with overwhelming volume. Shells rained down on suspected positions. Even if they could not penetrate armor directly, concussive blasts damaged optics, jammed turrets, and disoriented crews. Smoke obscured lines of sight, reducing the range advantage the Tigers depended on. And when skies cleared, fighter bombers returned. P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead, scanning for movement. A single Tiger caught on an exposed road risked becoming a burning wreck within minutes. German crews learned to move at dawn, dusk, or under cloud cover. Even then, the threat remained. Logistics compounded the danger. Each Tiger consumed vast amounts of fuel. Supplying 92 such machines strained transport networks already targeted by Allied bombing. Ammunition deliveries were inconsistent. Spare parts became precious commodities. Gradually, attrition began its quiet work. Some Tigers were lost in direct combat. Others were immobilized by mechanical failure, and destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. A few were abandoned when fuel ran out. Each loss reduced the concentrated striking power that had justified their deployment. Thus the stage was set for sustained confrontation, mass and armor against mobility and coordination. The 92 Tigers represented the last significant attempt to impose armored superiority on the Western Front in 1944.
By November 1944, the quiet fields and rolling hills of Lorraine had become a battleground of steel and fire. What had begun as a rapid American advance was now transforming into a brutal test of endurance. This was no longer a race across open France. It was a collision, German mass against American speed. At the center of it stood the U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton. Opposing them were reinforced German formations, including heavy tank battalions equipped with Tiger tanks. The stage was set for one of the most intense armored confrontations of the Western Front. Lorraine was deceptive terrain. It was not flat desert or endless steppe. Instead, it was a patchwork of forests, rivers, villages, ridgelines, and muddy farmland. The Moselle River cut across the region like a defensive barrier. Old French fortifications around Metz, some dating back to the 19th century, were integrated into German defensive plans. For American forces, every advance required river crossings under fire, assaults on fortified hills, and costly clearing operations through woods and towns. For the Germans, the terrain offered something priceless: defensive leverage. The first major clashes between Patton's armored spearheads and German heavy tanks were sudden and violent. American Sherman tanks advanced cautiously through mist-covered fields, their crews scanning hedgerows and tree lines. Then, often without warning, a flash erupted from concealed positions. Seconds later, a Sherman would explode or burst into flames, struck by an 88mm shell fired from a hidden Tiger. The range advantage of the Tiger was real. In open ground, German gunners could destroy American tanks before the Americans could effectively respond. Reports from frontline units described shells that seemed to come from invisible distances. But the battlefield was never one-sided. Patton's strength did not lie in individual tank superiority. It lay in coordination. When Tigers revealed their positions by firing, American artillery observers marked the location. Within minutes, sometimes seconds, massed artillery would respond. High explosive shells blanketed suspected German positions, shaking even the heaviest tanks. American doctrine emphasized combined arms. Tanks did not fight alone. Infantry advanced alongside them, identifying anti-tank positions. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with high-velocity guns maneuvered to flank heavy armor. Engineers cleared obstacles. Communication networks linked units with remarkable efficiency. And above all, the Third Army adapted. When long-range duels proved costly, American commanders shifted tactics. Instead of engaging Tigers head-on, they sought to outmaneuver them. Shermans used their superior mobility to flank through side roads and wooded areas. Smoke screens were deployed to obscure German lines of sight, reducing the range advantage of the 88mm gun. In several engagements near the approaches to Metz and Nancy, American units deliberately avoided predictable routes. They advanced at night, during fog, or under cover of artillery barrages. Speed, once again, became a weapon. Yet the Germans fought with determination. Heavy tank battalions were positioned at key crossroads and ridges. In defensive ambushes, they inflicted serious losses. Some American battalions reported multiple tanks destroyed in a single encounter. But sustaining such successes proved difficult. Lorraine's autumn rains transformed fields into mud. For 70-ton Tiger II tanks, this was a nightmare. Their immense weight caused them to sink into soft ground.
recovery required specialized vehicles, and those vehicles were scarce. Even Tiger I tanks, lighter but still massive, struggled off-road in wet conditions. Mechanical breakdowns increased. Transmissions overheated. Final drives failed. Tracks snapped under strain. When a Tiger broke down within range of American forces, it became a liability. Crews sometimes destroyed their own immobilized tanks with demolition charges rather than allow capture. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. A Tiger consumed extraordinary amounts of gasoline. German supply lines were under constant threat from Allied aircraft and artillery. Deliveries were delayed or destroyed. Some heavy tanks entered battle with barely enough fuel for limited maneuver. Meanwhile, the U.S. Third Army, though facing its own logistical challenges, benefited from vast industrial production and more flexible supply systems. When a Sherman was knocked out, replacements often arrived within days. When artillery ammunition ran low, convoys were organized rapidly. The contrast between industrial capacity and dwindling reserves became increasingly visible on the battlefield. Air power further tilted the balance. Whenever weather cleared, American P-47 Thunderbolts patrolled above the front. Armed with rockets and bombs, they hunted for German armor. A Tiger caught moving in daylight risked attack from above, its thick frontal armor offering little protection against plunging explosives. German crews adapted by hiding in forests, under camouflage nets, or within villages. Movement became cautious and often restricted to darkness. But such caution limited their ability to concentrate quickly against American breakthroughs. The clash became one of tempo versus weight. In one sector, a group of Tigers might halt an American advance for hours, even days. But elsewhere, Patton's forces would probe for weakness. If resistance stiffened in one area, he redirected pressure to another. Rather than batter endlessly at fortified points, he stretched German lines. This constant pressure forced German commanders to redeploy their heavy tanks repeatedly, and each redeployment carried risk, mechanical strain, air attack, fuel depletion. The siege of Metz exemplified the struggle. The city's forts were formidable. German defenders used them effectively, slowing American progress. Heavy tanks supported counterattacks aimed to push U.S. forces back from critical crossings. Yet even as tactical successes were achieved, the broader strategic picture worsened for Germany. Every engagement cost irreplaceable equipment. Every destroyed Tiger represented not only lost steel, but lost crew experience. American casualties were significant. Lorraine was not a swift victory. The Third Army paid in blood for every kilometer gained. Infantry suffered in cold rain and mud. Tank crews faced the terror of unseen guns. Artillery duels shook entire valleys. But momentum, though slowed, never fully stopped. By late November, American forces began to crack key defensive lines. Metz, after prolonged fighting, fell to the Third Army. German units withdrew eastward, step by step. For the heavy tank battalions, the situation was deteriorating. Numbers dwindled. Operational readiness declined. Some companies that had entered Lorraine with near full strength were reduced to a handful of functioning vehicles. What had begun as a concentrated steel barrier was becoming fragmented. The clash in Lorraine demonstrated a brutal truth of modern war. Technical superiority could win engagements, but sustaining that superiority required logistics, fuel, mobility, and air protection. Without those, even the most powerful tank became vulnerable. As December approached, the once formidable concentration of 92 Tigers had already begun to shrink under relentless pressure. The battle was not yet over. German commanders still hoped to stabilize the front, perhaps even regain initiative in a future counteroffensive. But in the fields of Lorraine, the balance was shifting. Steel had met speed, and speed, supported by coordination and industry, was beginning to prevail. By December 1944, the promise of a decisive German armored stand in Lorraine had begun to unravel. What had started as a powerful concentration of 92 Tiger tanks, machines designed to dominate battlefields, was now a shrinking force under relentless strain. The question was no longer whether the Tigers were formidable. The question was why so few of them were still operational. At first, losses came in flashes of violence. A Tiger exposed while repositioning would be struck by artillery. Another, firing from concealment, would reveal its location and draw a concentrated counterfire. In close-range engagements, American tank destroyers, equipped with high-velocity guns, found flanking shots. Even Shermans, when maneuvered skillfully, could penetrate side armor at shorter distances. But direct combat accounted for only part of the decline. Artillery became one of the most effective tools against heavy armor. American fire control was highly developed by late 1944. Forward observers, sometimes positioned in church towers or forward outposts, relayed coordinates rapidly. When a Tiger fired, muzzle flash and dust signatures gave away its position. Within minutes, shells blanketed the area. While a direct hit might not always penetrate thick armor, repeated concussive blasts damaged optics, jammed turret mechanisms, and wounded exposed crew members. Even near misses could disable tracks or immobilize a vehicle in churned mud. Once immobilized, a Tiger's greatest strengths became irrelevant. Air power intensified the attrition. Whenever weather cleared, P-47 Thunderbolts swept over road networks and open terrain. Armed with rockets capable of piercing armor from above, they targeted German supply columns and any armored movement detected. Tigers were instructed to remain concealed during daylight, but concealment limited operational flexibility. If a heavy tank battalion needed to redeploy quickly to counter an American breakthrough, daylight movement risked destruction. If it waited until night, American forces could widen the breach. Logistics delivered perhaps the most decisive blow. Each Tiger consumed extraordinary quantities of fuel. By late 1944, German supply lines were overstretched and under constant attack. Fuel depots were bombed, rail lines were severed, convoys were ambushed or strafed. Even when fuel reached forward units, it was often insufficient for sustained maneuver. Reports from the front described tanks abandoned simply because there was no gasoline left. Crews destroyed their own vehicles with demolition charges to prevent capture. Mechanical failures compounded the crisis. The Tiger II, though powerful, was notoriously heavy. Its transmission and final drive systems were under constant stress. Muddy Lorraine fields were unforgiving terrain for a 70-ton machine. Gearboxes overheated, engines failed. Recovery vehicles were scarce, and towing a disabled Tiger itself was a difficult operation. Some tanks never reached the battlefield at all. Others broke down after only limited engagement. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly in freezing conditions, cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others running. Spare parts became precious commodities. A single broken component could sideline an entire machine indefinitely. As weeks passed, the once concentrated group of 92 Tigers fragmented into scattered survivors. Some were destroyed in defensive stands, others were lost during attempted counterattacks. A number were abandoned in villages and fields, later discovered by advancing American troops as silent steel hulks. American forces documented captured Tigers with fascination. For many U.S. soldiers, these tanks had been the subject of fearful rumors. Now they were physical proof that even the most feared weapon could be reduced to wreckage. The psychological balance shifted. Early in the Lorraine fighting, reports of Tiger presence caused caution and tension among American tank crews. By December, while respect remained, fear had diminished. Crews understood that Tigers were rare, that they required support, and that they could be isolated. Patton's emphasis on tempo continued to strain German defenders. Rather than massing all forces against known Tiger positions, he applied pressure across multiple sectors. This forced German commanders to split their remaining heavy armor, weakening its concentration. A Tiger alone was powerful. A Tiger unsupported, low on fuel and exposed to artillery and aircraft, was vulnerable. Winter conditions added further difficulty. Cold temperatures affected engines and hydraulic systems. Ice complicated movement. Crews endured harsh conditions inside steel hulls with limited heating. Fatigue set in. By late December, as German attention increasingly shifted towards preparations for the Ardennes counteroffensive, what would become the Battle of the Bulge, heavy tank resources in Lorraine were no longer what they had been. The numbers told the story. From the original 92 Tiger tanks committed to the effort, operational readiness declined steadily. Some were destroyed outright in combat, others were irreparably damaged. Many were immobilized by mechanical breakdown or lack of fuel, and subsequently scuttled by their crews. In certain battalions, only a handful of vehicles remained battle-ready at any given time. Fewer than 5 of the original concentration were fully operational by the time the Lorraine fighting subsided. The steel hammer had fractured. This outcome was not the result of a single catastrophic engagement. There was no singular battlefield where all 92 were annihilated in one dramatic clash. Instead, attrition, constant, grinding, multifaceted, reduced them day by day. Artillery, airstrikes, mud, fuel shortages, mechanical strain, tactical isolation, relentless pressure. Modern war had evolved beyond duels of singular superiority. It rewarded integration, supply resilience, and adaptability. The Tigers had been designed to dominate through armor and firepower, and in individual engagements they often did, but they could not overcome systemic imbalance. The United States possessed industrial capacity capable of replacing losses rapidly. It maintained air superiority over Western Europe. Its logistical networks, though imperfect, were expansive and flexible. And under Patton's command, its operational tempo denied the enemy time to consolidate. As American forces advanced eastward, they passed burned-out hulks along roadsides, silent reminders of a strategy that had gambled on concentrated heavy armor to halt momentum. For German crews who believed in the invincibility of their machines, the reality was sobering. They had fought with skill and determination. They had inflicted losses, but they had been consumed by a war of attrition they could not sustain. By the end of the Lorraine campaign, the once formidable force sent to stop Patton had been reduced to fragments. 92 Tiger tanks had entered the struggle. Fewer than 5 remained operational. The myth of armored supremacy had not vanished overnight, but it had been deeply cracked. And as the front shifted closer to Germany's borders, the consequences of that failure would reverberate far beyond the fields of Lorraine.
By early 1945, the smoke over Lorraine had thinned, but the consequences of the fighting were unmistakable. What had once been presented as a decisive armored barrier, 92 Tiger tanks concentrated to halt a single American general, had dissolved into scattered wreckage and exhausted crews. The attempt to stop General George S. Patton with massed heavy armor had failed. But the deeper meaning of that failure went far beyond a single campaign. When the last operational Tigers withdrew eastward or were destroyed in place, something larger collapsed with them, the illusion that technological superiority alone could stabilize a crumbling front. For years, German armored doctrine had relied on qualitative edge, thicker armor, more powerful guns, highly trained crews. In earlier phases of the war, that edge had delivered stunning victories. By late 1944, the equation had changed. The Western Allies possessed overwhelming industrial strength. The United States alone produced tens of thousands of tanks during the war. While a Tiger required immense resources and time to manufacture, American factories turned out Shermans in vast numbers. Quantity did not automatically equal victory, but combined with coordination and logistics, it created resilience. Lorraine proved that resilience mattered more than isolated superiority. After the fall of Metz and the continued push eastward, Patton's Third Army pressed toward the German border. The Saar industrial region, one of Germany's key production centers, lay increasingly exposed. Every kilometer gained tightened the pressure on the Reich's war economy. German commanders were forced into reactive strategy. Instead of dictating terms, they responded to Allied advances. Heavy tank battalions that had once symbolized offensive power were now used as emergency fire brigades, rushed from crisis to crisis. But by this stage of the war, crises were constant. The failed effort to halt Patton in Lorraine also influenced German strategic thinking leading into the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler sought one last dramatic counterstroke in December 1944, aiming to split Allied forces and force negotiations. Heavy tanks would again be committed in large numbers, yet the lessons of Lorraine lingered. Fuel shortages remained critical. Mechanical reliability continued to plague the heaviest vehicles. Air superiority, when weather permitted, still belonged overwhelmingly to the Allies. The fundamental imbalance had not been corrected. For American forces, the Lorraine campaign reinforced key doctrinal principles. Combined arms warfare, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support, had proven decisive. No single weapon system dominated alone. Coordination and communication multiplied effectiveness. Patton himself emerged from the campaign with his aggressive philosophy validated. Though slowed by terrain, weather, and stiff resistance, his insistence on maintaining pressure prevented the Germans from consolidating their heavy armor advantage. By forcing constant movement, he exploited the vulnerabilities of machines that depended on stability and supply. It is important to recognize that the German tank crews fought with determination and skill. Many engagements were hard-fought and costly for American units. Tigers knocked out significant numbers of Shermans in certain encounters. Individual bravery on both sides was undeniable. But war at this stage was no longer decided by isolated tactical brilliance. It was decided by systems. The Allied system, production, fuel supply, repair networks, air coordination, and flexible command structures functioned under immense strain, yet continued to operate. The German system, battered by years of total war and strategic bombing, struggled to sustain its most advanced weapons. As American forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, the remnants of heavy tank units were absorbed into desperate defensive efforts. Some Tigers fought to the last shell in defense of towns and river crossings. Others were abandoned when fuel ran dry. A few were captured intact, later examined carefully by Allied engineers eager to understand their construction. But they no longer shaped the strategic picture. The collapse of German armored supremacy in Lorraine symbolized a broader transformation of modern warfare. Heavy armor remained important, but without air cover, logistical depth, and industrial backing, even the most formidable machine could not alter the outcome of a sustained campaign. For Patton's Third Army, the road eastward continued. In the months that followed, American forces would cross the Rhine, penetrate deep into Germany, and contribute to the final collapse of the Nazi regime. Looking back, the commitment of 92 Tiger tanks to stop one advancing army stands as a stark example of desperation meeting momentum. It was a bold concentration of power intended to deliver a decisive halt. Instead, it was consumed piece by piece. Fewer than 5 remained operational by the time the campaign ended.
not because the tanks were poorly designed, not because their crews lacked courage, but because the environment of late-war Europe, dominated by Allied air power, industrial output, and coordinated offensives, rendered isolated concentrations of heavy armor insufficient. Steel alone could not compensate for systemic weakness. In the end, Lorraine was not just a regional battle, it was a demonstration of how modern warfare had evolved. Speed, supply, coordination, and adaptability outweighed thickness of armor. Flexibility defeated rigidity. Sustained pressure overcame concentrated mass. And as the burned-out hulls of Tiger tanks lay scattered across muddy fields, they marked more than tactical losses. They marked the fading twilight of Germany's armored dominance in the West and the irreversible advance of Allied momentum toward final victory.